Here, I'll show you. Um, so I wrote this book called All the Horrors of War, A Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And the UK version was published at the same time. So I thought I'd show you the cover of that too. That same text, same images, but that publisher came up with a completely different concept for the cover. But I wanted you to see the girl full standing. That's my mom. This is about 7 months after the war. She's in a tuberculosis sanitarium in snowy northwest Sweden in Arvika. And you can see the serious look in her eye. And you can see that by this point, she's well nourished, but she's very, very sick. She has TB and she's orphaned. She lost her parents in Auschwitz, Birkenau. The last time she saw her parents and four younger siblings was on the ramp in Birkenau. And she survived barely by a hair with her older sister. So here she is in Sweden. And this is a picture of Glenn Hughes. You can see he's kind of startled. He was the British medical officer, very high ranking at the time of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, where my mom was. And he was deputy director of medical services for the British Second Army. And here he is in his caravan on the premises of Bergen-Belsen. So I had quite the challenge writing a book telling the story, a dual biography of people who converged in Bergen-Belsen, but whose paths would never have crossed otherwise. You have a very high-ranking military medical officer, and you have a young girl, right? She was 14 when she was deported to Auschwitz and 15 at the time of the liberation from Bergen-Belsen. So I decided, ultimately, I rewrote the manuscript a few times, and I settled on telling the story as a race against time rescue story. What happened in the last year of World War II? So the meat of the book is really the 4 seasons from the spring of 1944 to the 5th season, the point of convergence in Bergen-Belsen. And it's sandwiched in between some paragraphs about the Belsen trial, which sets the case, what's really what Bergen-Belsen was about, and tells certain very significant things from the trial. And here is an Army Talks magazine from November 1945, and you can see the makeshift courtroom out of a gymnasium in the outskirts of Lüneburg, Germany, in which you have 45 defendants with these numbers hanging from their chests. And the prosecution. And what is significant about the trial, and which I talk about in my book, is that Glenn Hughes was the first witness. And this trial immediately preceded the Nuremberg trials and was the first trial to apply international law to war crimes. And it's sandwiched further between a prologue and an epilogue, in which I talk more about my protagonists, a very significant event that happened in the very beginning of the war that involved my mom's family. And the epilogue talks about really what happened for my mom in the 10 post-war years as she's recuperating in and out of TB sanatoriums in Sweden. And then really about Glenn Hughes after the war, after his experience of liberating Bergen-Belsen and being unable to save so many war-torn people. I mean, so many were dying by the thousands in Bergen-Belsen even after the liberation. And what does he go on to do with what he saw and his life and his relationship with survivors? So I start the story in the Yorkshire Wolds, where Glenn Hughes at this point is directing the medical corps for the British Second Army's 8th Corps. And they're practicing in the Yorkshire Wolds. And my mom is in Seget, that is where she is from. And I'm just going to tell you about a couple of things along the way as the British Army lands in the Normandy coast and what happens. I'm just going to show you a few images, but I really detail in my book what is concerning to Glenn Hughes as the army is fighting and as they break through the fortress of Germany and eventually come and liberate Bergen-Belsen, and also about my mom's journey through these various places, and Auschwitz, and then a labor camp, and then a death march, and then ultimately winding up in Bergen-Belsen, really 1 month before the liberating forces get there, the British Army gets there. So the Yorkshire Wolds was chosen for its similarity in topography to the coast of Normandy. Of course, the hedgerows were quite difficult and a surprise when the Eighth Corps was fighting there. And the Eighth Corps met up with some of the most ferocious Panzer troops and German army units, and it was just grueling fighting. But Glyn Hughes was a stalwart for preparedness. He was having people very early on in the Yorkshire Wolds practice taking down and setting up the medical facilities, the casualty clearing stations, the regimental aid posts. And he had basically, it was so much practice and really down to a science in terms of even how long a surgery would take. Of course, as the fighting was taking place, when he was there, he had to commandeer hospitals, find places where how to evacuate. Transportation became really critical in evacuating the war wounded, and how to really give the best service possible to the soldiers who were fighting. So I'm just going to mention just something striking about June 6, 1944, where this 150,000 troops landed, Allied troops landed on the coast of Normandy. It was just this amazing armada of ships that landed and totally taking the Germans by surprise, who were expecting them in Calais. And I talk a lot about in the book about Glyn Hughes and what he's finding as he lands on D-Day plus 6. But what's really significant about June 6, 1944, in comparison to my mother's experiences, let's say, is that on June 6th, there were, among all those Allied forces landing, there were half the number of soldiers who were killed as people who were killed in Auschwitz on that very same day. And by this point, my mom had been in Auschwitz for about 3 weeks. And these are photographs that are just kind of amazing. They were, there was, I don't know if you've heard of the Auschwitz album. Have you heard of the Auschwitz album?
Yep.
Yeah, where some SS officers did take photographs, and they were discovered later after the war. There's like 193 of them. And it's the only real visual documentation we have of the arrivals and the process of killing the Jews that were coming in. And during the summer of 1944 was the wiping out of Hungarian Jewry, right? They made it all the way. I mean, the Wannsee Conference was in 1942. We're talking more than 2 years later, and it was pretty clear that the Germans were losing the war, but they were hell-bent on killing as many of the Jews in Hungary, the last unmolested mass of Jews in Nazi occupied territory. They came in on March 1944 and immediately ghettoized the Jews and deported them. So these images that we have in the Auschwitz album are all from a Hungarian Jewish deportation to Auschwitz. And while this looks like a kind of an organized scene here, the women and children are here and the men are here, you can see that there's a lot of chaos. If you took a magnifying glass and zoomed in and really looked at sort of this woman, is she turning to talk to a child, and are these men like turning and talking to each other, and really what they might be saying is, where are we? Like, what is this place? I think this was a deportation from Bergen-Belsen, one of the Hungarian provincial towns. And you could just see that people are, they just have no idea where they are. And these are the men in these striped kind of pajamas who were members of the Sonderkommando, had to take people off the trains. And they're the ones who were like sometimes whispering under their breath instructions to people who had no idea where they were, like saying to a young woman, give your small child to the grandma, just give your child to the grandma. because, and or like Elie Wiesel wrote in his book, like someone said to tell him he was 18, or just trying to give people a chance at being selected for life, as opposed to really being ushered to the gas chambers. And so here's just a few more images. Here are women who were selected, picked to work. This occurred at a time when the war was raging, Hitler was losing, and they had exhausted a lot of their slave labor pool. And here was this new, fresh group of potential slave laborers coming into Auschwitz, and they decided to siphon off some, the most able-bodied, for work in the factories and the Third Reich. And so my mother would look at this picture and say, oh, those women were lucky because they had scarves on their head. All the women had their heads shaven. Her transport, no, they were just shaven. And here are images from Canada, which was the place where they took in a lot of, where people came. I mean, people came to Auschwitz, they didn't know where they were being taken. They brought suitcases, they brought their treasured items with them, and all of these were sorted and shipped back into the Third Reich, but they needed a lot of person power to do it. So if you were lucky, the very lucky internees were selected to work in Canada sorting goods. And there was just so much plunder and stealing of things that belonged to the Jews. All over Europe, once they were taken out of their homes, they were just, the non-Jewish neighbors went in and ransacked them, and only in very, very, very humane circumstances were some of the Jews' things saved for them, less, in case they returned. But a lot of the things were just stolen outright from the Jews.
Now, were the Jews from Hungary that were being sent to these camps, they're the ones that were sent to Auschwitz?
Yeah, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was 3 parts to Auschwitz. Auschwitz I, which was the main camp. Auschwitz II, which was about 2 miles away, which was Birkenau, which was where they had 4 gas chambers and ovens, and really were equipped to do the mass murder. They were especially getting ready for the Hungarian deportation, and they increased the number of Sonderkommando working in the vicinity of the gas chambers. And yeah, they were taken to Birkenau, where the ovens were going day and night, 24 hours a day. So like I said, twice as many people were killed on June 6th in Auschwitz as Allied soldiers were killed fighting on the D-Day. Moreover, the number of soldiers killed each day after D-Day, which was high and tragic and horrible, was decreased, whereas the number of Jews that were killed in Auschwitz continued to be at that peak number of about 10,000 people a day for at least a month after D-Day.
Bernice, were the ovens in Auschwitz or Birkenau?
Birkenau.
And what about the gas chambers?
In Birkenau. I think there was one in Auschwitz, but there were 4 major ones in Birkenau.
Okay.
Birkenau is where most of the Jews
That
were.
was the real extermination center.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So I'm just going to show you, I spent a lot of time in the Glyn Hughes's archives in the Museum of Military Medicine, or the Wellcome Medical Library in London. And this is just a few of the things. This is just his handwriting and some of the things he was concerned with. This shows you like a chart of the Neptune battle casualties, and here's D+1, D+2, D+3, and how many casualties, how many were killed drowning, how many were wounded, how many had to be evacuated. And here he's just charting the number of hospitals he's finding as they're fighting, and sometimes they had to transport men back to Bayeux, which was near Normandy, and all the special units that had to be brought in for to treat the men. So I just lifted just a few things from the thousands and thousands of notes and pages that he had in the archives. And here's some pictures. that he had from the fighting. You could see, I'm not sure where this is, but you can see that as they came in, people were cheering them. They were the liberators as they came into these towns. And you can see even the fighting, and this was in the town of Lingen as they crossed over the Rhine, and the German officers are surrendering to British officers here. And this is sort of British humor. If you want to see Blighty Britain again, camouflage your vehicles, and between these points your enemy lies, and he, like you, can use his eyes. So show no light and he won't get wise. So it's just, yeah, the fighting was pretty terrible. And then at a certain point, this is in January 27th. So this is the winter of 1945. And I describe where my mom is, what she's doing. I describe what Glenn Hughes is up to. But just to give you some context, the liberation of Auschwitz took place on January 27th, 1945. And this date was chosen as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But what's really important to realize is that when the Russians came in and liberated Auschwitz, there was fewer than 8,000 people in the camp. There was about 1,200 in Auschwitz I, the main camp, 5,800 in Auschwitz II, right, Birkenau, and 600 in Auschwitz III, which was Buna. Buna means synthetic rubber, where they used slave labor. So there was a total, that was about 4 miles from Auschwitz I. So there was a total of fewer than 8,000 people here at the time of the liberation. What happened is the Germans realized that the war was over, and they had a couple of mantras, couple of things that were occupying them. One is that no inmate should fall alive into Allied hands, and they were going to get everyone away. They went to great lengths in some of the camps to bury bodies, exhume them from mass graves, burn them. There was going to be no evidence of their crime. So in mid-January, they started this forced death march away from Auschwitz. They took about 60,000 prisoners on this march, marching them deep into Germany, away from the Soviet liberators. So 2 weeks later, when the Soviet forces came to Auschwitz, there were fewer than 8,000 people, and there were all these people on this death march. So it started in Auschwitz. They would march people either northwest or straight west, and they picked up people from other camps along the way, or people started on the death marches at the end of January from some of these camps. And it was kind of a very chaotic time. The Germans really had no plans other than no inmate should fall alive into German hands. So they just marched them, and it was a freezing, bitter cold winter. People did not have adequate clothing, adequate footwear, barely any food. And in January, there was about something like 715,000 inmates alive in the various camps, in this network of camps that were part of the Nazi system. And somewhere between a third to a half died along the way on these death marches. In my book, I described my mom's experiences of that, and she had just turned 15, and how she sort of managed to survive. But there weren't too many directives, except for if anyone couldn't keep up, they had to be shot. So all along the way, there was blood-covered snow where people were just shot when they couldn't keep up on the march, which was brutal. And they wound up in places like Flossenburg, where Himmler gave an order that everyone was to be killed before the Allied liberators reached that place. And a lot of them wound up in Bergen-Belsen. So Bergen-Belsen morphed from a concentration camp into a real death camp, because by the time the Allied forces reached Bergen-Belsen, there were 60,000 inmates there, and about in the month of March, about 17,000 died. And Anne Frank died there at the end of February, beginning of March. I mean, it was, the conditions were unspeakable. I know that we can't imagine them. I will show you some images, but you had people just that were being dumped there. It was just the depository for the war ravaged, the people who had been strong, who had managed to evade the gas chambers of Auschwitz. They survived slave labor. They survived the death marches, and they were dumped in Bergen-Belsen. There wasn't adequate housing. There was barely any food. In the last 5 days, there was no food and no water. There were some transport came in February with typhus. There was a raging typhus epidemic, and there was an epidemic of tuberculosis, and almost everybody had gastroenteritis. And there was also seen almost every disease known to humankind. And this was where the largest number of people were liberated at the end of the war. In a sense, this was how it ended. So whereas Auschwitz was sort of a spick and span hell, where people were coming nourished from home, and they were killed right away in the gas chambers and went up in smoke in the crematoria. In Bergen-Belsen, they were skeletons. There were a lot of Muslims, they called them. They were just people who were really just stumbling around, and it was a very frightful, macabre, obscene scene. So on April 15th, 1945, 3 weeks before the end of the war, is when the camp was turned over by the Germans to the British. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. And it's a truth is stranger than fiction story. And I describe it in my book, but it's so 3 weeks before the end of the war, there was fighting in the area, and there was a truce on April 12th, and the camp was handed over to the British. So one part of the truth was that they had to have danger typhus signs erected everywhere en route. And here are the jeeps coming in, the British Army. And here, Bergen-Belsen had different sections. Some of the more recent arrivals were placed in Camp 2, which had about 20,000 people in it, but about 41,000 were in Camp 1, which was called the Horror Camp, which was bisected by a road. There were 3 huge compounds on one side, 2 on the other, separated by gender, and a lot of skeletal beings wandered around, and piles of dead. And the dead and living were sharing the same quarters. They were these huts. The British called them huts. So I tremble in showing you some of these images, but they help to explain the situation. So you have to realize that there was about 45 Nazis, SS officers brought to trial, right? At the Belsen trial, I showed you an image of that. But there was about 480 Nazi functionaries at the camp. Most of them took off right away before even the handover, and about 80 remained in the camp for the handover to facilitate the transition. And here you see British officers are pressing the SS into service to help to clean up the camp and take these human beings and load them onto trucks and bring them to mass graves. And here in the background, you see some of the DPs. They were called displaced persons that were watching and probably jeering the SS officers. And here you see one of the mass graves. There were about 15 of these that were dug. They were about 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet wide, and 40 to 50 feet long. And here is Rabbi Leslie Hardman, who's a chaplain who came in with the British Second Army, who's just so bereft at how people are being buried helter-skelter in these mass graves. And if you were to visit Bergen-Belsen today, which is really an amazing, has a beautifully done exhibit, and there are reasons for that too, but there is a tombstone here for Margot and Anne Frank. And I read somewhere that they thought they could identify where they were buried. Well, they were not buried here for sure. They were buried in one of these mass graves. as was my mother's cousin, Rachel Hecht, and so many people who everyone had lives before, right? Before this terrible way of having to bury them. And there were markers. This is at the time they marked the graves with these, some had 5,000, some had 10,000, some had 2,000. And now if you were to go visit the camp now, they have, much more beautiful granite, I think it's granite, tombstone markers, but they just did this they had to do it all very, very quickly. And honestly, it was just guesswork into terms of how many people were buried in these various graves. And this image I show of the huts and the tents that the British Army erected. I show this girl because you see she has a square cut out of the back of her coat. And a lot of the people who were working in slave labor camps it was cold, it was the winter, and they did get some clothing that was taken away from Jews at Auschwitz. But all the coats had to have these big squares cut out of the back, lest these halfling, these prisoners try to escape, they should be easily identifiable. So here are some more images of the liberation and the squalor. And of course, everyone from my mother and any survivor and Glenn Hughes and any liberator would say you had to have been there, right? We don't see the panorama, we don't smell the stench of the bodies, but what you can see in this picture is how these newly liberated prisoners who still had some skin and bones on them are totally inured to the background and what's going on. And this reminded me of a scene of my mom and her sister who were trying to cook potatoes after the war, after the liberation. And this is another image that probably doesn't look like much to you, but is really significant to me and really very much a part of my mother's story, because here you see the huts and here you see the tents that were pitched on April 18th, 3 days after the liberation. And the huts were so overcrowded with the living and the dead that in order to clean them and get a sip of water to inmates who were there, they pitched tents that if you could still walk, if you were well enough to walk, you had to go out and stay in the tent. And my mom was in a tent with 4 other girls, and she got kicked out of the tent and had to crawl back to the hut. That's why the distance is really significant for me in terms of how far did she have to go to get from the tent to the hut, and then what happened to her when she went back into the hut. And the British, at first, I have to tell you, Glenn Hughes was devastated. I told you that he was a stalwart for preparedness, and this was a situation unlike anything he had ever seen. And when he testified at the Belsen trial, he said he had seen all the horrors of war, but nothing to touch it. And he didn't initially know how he would go about trying to save as many lives as possible. Within a few days, with the help of leading medical officers in the British Second Army, they decided on a triage system. And part of that system was what they called the human laundry, where medics would go into the huts one by one and mark inmates with a piece of chalk on their forehead, mark them. If they still had any life in them, they could be evacuated. And so they still had a chance at life. And of course, with like any triage system, they made some errors. Like this isn't like an impossible situation. So there were people who probably had a chance of life that they left for dead. They couldn't take everybody right away. And there were probably people who would have had no chance of making it that they still evacuated. It was an imperfect, very quick triage system. And here you see the men from the 11th Light Field Ambulance, and they're dressed in some kind of protective clothing, right? I don't know, hazmat suits, I don't know what you'd call them, but they're evacuating the very sick from the huts in what they called contaminated ambulances, and taking them to this place they called the human laundry, which was a cavalry stables about 1.5 miles from the main camp, which they set up with 60 tables. and they pressed German nurses from the area. Were really low on person power, so they had to corral German nurses to wash and spray the skeletal inmates with DDT before putting them in clean ambulances, in clean blankets, and taking them to a makeshift hospital room. So of course, in the book, I detail both the liberators' view of this, Glenn Hughes, as he's masterminding the whole thing, and my mom, who's like, what's happening on the ground to her, an actual inmate who's going through all this, who's really by this point unconscious, barely conscious. So here's some approximate numbers. I'll read from the bottom, but before I do, I just want you to understand one of the reasons that I chose to write this dual biography and chose to write about Glenn Hughes is because he was such a standout character. And nobody really, he doesn't have, like a lot of people don't know about him, but he was so compassionate and was so morally motivated to try to save lives that the inmates who had some medical background who were assisting him chose to name the hospital in the area the Glenn Hughes Hospital. And fast forward, I mean, after the war, like 2,000 babies were born in the years after the war in the Glenn Hughes Hospital. So anyway, there were 14,000 patients in the Glenn Hughes Hospital, the largest such facility in Europe, on May 19th, 1945, a month after the liberation. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried in Bergen-Belsen. 500 former inmates died each day for a month after the liberation. It was very hard, as I mentioned, to get people to help. The medical units were all engaged in with battles in Northwest Germany, but 361 British Army soldiers and medical personnel worked in the relief of Bergen-Belsen the second day after the liberation. There were about 750 to 1,000 sick processed each day for over 3 weeks after the liberation at the Human Laundry, the place for washing and disinfecting survivors. And so when Glenn Hughes came in, he estimated that there were about 25,000 in need of immediate hospitalization. These are huge numbers, so it's really hard to get our head around them, but he also quite accurately estimated that he wouldn't be able to save about 13,000 of them. And there were 25,000 who were deemed fit, meaning they could walk up 3 steps to a wagon and able to walk, and they were transferred to a formerly Wehrmacht transit and rehabilitation barracks. And it was very fungible. Like if someone could barely walk, they fell sick, they went to the hospital. If they got better and they were in the hospital for a few weeks, they went to the transit and rehabilitation barracks. But there were about 55 to 60,000 sick and dying prisoners found in Bergen-Belsen at the time of the liberation. And this was, again, the largest number of survivors were found here at Bergen-Belsen. There was maybe 30,000 at Dachau. And again, these are such big numbers, it's so hard to fathom. But May 8th came and went with Glenn Hughes just unwilling to hoist the Union Jack, the British flag, and recognize that it was Victory in Europe Day. It was not going to be over for him until the last evacuated hut was burned down. And so here there is a ceremony after each hut was evacuated, it was burned down. And here's the one where the last hut was burned down. And you could see both British soldiers and DPs came to witness this ceremony and this event. And here's Glenn Hughes, who gave the order for the torching of the last hut. And here's the largest part of the hospital that was called the Glenn Hughes Hospital. And this is kind of a little interesting aside. This country of Maldives, little country off the coast of Sri Lanka, issued these commemorative stamps for the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And one of them is of the scene of the hut being burned down. It was a very significant moment. Here's the actual photograph, and here's the stamp, and you could see there was an effigy of Hitler on it. And then comes another chapter. And my mother was largely not part of this chapter because the Swedish government took in about 7,000 survivors to rehabilitate them. And she could not make a decision for herself. She was 15, she was really sick. And she just went to Sweden and they took care of things for her. But people who remained in Bergen-Belsen, it was kind of interesting because they were mostly the strong survivors, right? These were mostly people in their 20s and 30s, and some had been married before, but they didn't know the fate of their spouses, and they were pairing up and getting married. And it was like a world record, and they were having babies right away. As I mentioned, 2,000 babies were born in the years after the war at the Bergen-Belsen hospital. And because the British wanted them to be repatriated to go home, and they had no homes to go to, most of them, they just waited in this displaced persons camp, and they established their own kind of community there. And a lot of their life revolved around these small children. And they had a theater where they put on these amazing performances of their immediate past experiences that were very cathartic. You had an audience of 2,000 people bawling their eyes out watching these shows. And the Organization for Rehabilitation and Training came and tried to give these people skills as welders or dental technicians, or seamstresses. So you had a lot going on in the DP camp, and it was sort of a magnet. It was in the German zone of Germany, and people were coming from other places as well. There was, at its height, there was about 12,000 people in this holding pen in this DP camp in Germany. And here's just a couple of images. This was very soon after the war. This man, Jacob Tenenbaum, was an artist, and he did a series of 11 drawings while he was in the Glen Hughes Hospital. And this was one that says, "We survived, what now?" Just shows how shaky things were for these survivors. And then fast forward a few years, 1949, here's a birth certificate for the second baby that was born in the second child born to this couple in the Glen Hughes Hospital. And the survivors were really united around a common goal, which is open the gates of Palestine to us. And so I talk a lot about that. And it was a big political movement, and I describe it in my book. And Glen Hughes was very sympathetic to the cause. And I'm going to now play for you a brief video of a rabbi, Tzvi Asaria Herman Helfgott, who was a Yugoslavian POW who came to the Bergen-Belsen camp very soon after the war when he saw they needed help.
אני עברתי יום יום מבלוק לבלוק לראות מי נפטר, להוציא אותם ולקבור אותם. אבל מה? הייתה פקודה מאנגלים שאי אפשר קבר אחים לעשות בגלל המחלות, אלא קבר אחים. קבר אחים. כולם יחד. כלומר, שורה אחת, נגיד 20-30, על זה כן סיד, כן, ועל זה שוב כן איזה 30-20 וזה, כמו שהיה במחנה המוות הזה, איפה שאלפים כן. אבל יום אחד ניגשה אליי אישה, ואמרה לי, רבי, שמעתי היום שבבלוק הזה וזה, ביתי נפטרה. אז אמרתי, אז מה לעשות? אני רוצה קבר בשבילה, קבר יחיד. אמרתי, אבל זה בלתי אפשרי. אבל לכן אני מבקשת ממך. אז אמרתי לה, את יודעת מה? בלילה כשחיילים בדרך כלל, האנגלים, נמצאים במועדונים, אז אנחנו נקבור אותם. אנחנו נביא את הגופה, ואנחנו כן נקבור אותם. ובאמת, בלילה היא קמה מהמיטה, ואני ניסיתי מהר לקבור אותה, קדיש להגיד, ופתאום כשאני רציתי כבר סתום את הגולם, היא אומרת לי, רגע אחד רבי, והיא פנתה עם העיניים לשמיים ואמרה, ריבונו של עולם, ביידיש, אני מודה לך לזכות הגדולה שנתת לי היום לקבור את ביתי במו ידיי. אמן. מרגע זה, אני מוכרח להגיד, נעשיתי אדם אחר. עשינו עכשיו את הכל על מנת לעזור לאנשים, כן, בדרך לחיים. ופה התחלנו לאשכול לדאוג, היו כמה ילדים לגן ילדים, ואחר כך להקים בית ספר, כן. פה עזרו לנו הרבה אנשי בריגדה שהגיעו כבר בזמן הזה, כן, לברגן-בלזן גם כן. והקמנו כבר גם כן תיאטרון, כן. חיים חדשים התחילו, כן. ופה אני עסקתי עד 48, כן. פה בתורה, חתונות התחילו, כן. ברית מילות, כן, וכו' וכו' וכו'. ואני לא צריך להדגיש כמה שאני הייתי מאושר. כל משפחה רצתה שבברית מילה שאני נתת לכולם, חופה וקידושים, שאני אחזיק את הילד. היום המאושר ביותר בחיים שלי היה בילד האלף כשאני החזקתי לידיו. הילד האלף. אני עברתי.
Whoops. And here's a picture of my mom. This is the first picture we have of her. And here she is in the first place where she got individualized medical attention in a makeshift hospital in Sweden. These are all surviving teenagers. And that's it. That's my presentation. And if you have any questions later, you can always reach me through my website